Okay.
I'm not going to do that. Okay, what are you
1 Timothy chapter 2,
8?
verses 8 through 15.
Okay, 8 through 15. All right. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was first formed, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control.
Okay, the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
You're like, this is one of those like, really? Thanks be to God. I'm not sure. It's hard. It's amazing how when you read this passage, depending on even how you read it and what you emphasize as you read it, you can really shift the tone. You didn't do that, but like, you can. You could read this in a really kind of sarcastic way. And the more you read it that way, the more Paul's just going to look like a dick. Okay? Now, there's also ways that we can read it more empathetically. And what I'm going to try to do today is help you read it empathetically. And I know there's some hard stuff in here, so we're really going to kind of talk that, like, today is the day for everybody to ask questions, particularly over lunch, okay? But I'm going to try to blast through. So let's put this in context. 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. This is Paul's problem with women, part 3. It's our third week in one of the most difficult passages in the New Testament. And it's actually not just difficult to understand, but it's also difficult to embrace because it feels so backwards. Okay? Now, real quickly, very, very quickly, here's what we spent the last 2 weeks talking about. First of all, there's 3 basic options for how you're going to deal with this. One option is Paul's just wrong. And there's some challenges if you're going to take that approach. Like, how do you know that Paul's wrong? What's your objective standard that allows you to like zoom in and go, this is wrong, this is right? Where do you get that from? And we've talked about that. But there's 2 other things, 2 other ways. One is to say, Paul's not necessarily wrong, but what he said was timely. It was actually fitting for that culture. Or you can say, no, it's timeless. It should be this way for all cultures. In either of those cases, timely or timeless, we need to understand how it would have actually made sense to those people. And this gets us into the second thing that we talked about a lot last week. It's basically, there's a historical conundrum that we really need to be more aware of. It often gets overlooked. The historical conundrum runs something like this. The Roman Empire was very heavily male, like more men than women. Okay, male-centric, very patriarchal. Like, you think Christianity's patriarchal? You ought to see the Roman Empire, okay? We also know that the early Christian church was predominantly female. We know that historically. In other words, so you've got a culture that's predominantly male, more men than women, and you've got an emerging community that is way more women than men. What does that tell you? Women are opting into this thing. And so what that means is we have to go, why on earth, if this thing is so anti-women, would they have gotten in? There must be something in here that would have actually felt like good news to them, not bad news. And so we need to try hard to understand how they saw it through their culture as opposed to just seeing it through our culture and kind of writing it off. So this week what I want to talk about is, all right, what's Paul saying in the text? There's 5 things that he affirms. I didn't get to this part last week. Okay? So basically, I just want to kind of say he's actually making some really big affirmations in here of women. And I want to try to show you those so that at the very least we can appreciate what's going on in the text as opposed to just writing Paul off. Doesn't mean he's right. Doesn't mean he's wrong. But we should at least be able to say, oh, I understand why women in that day and age might have found this really good news. Okay? Before I do that, I want to make a prefatory comment, which will take like 2 minutes. And at the very end, I'm going to make kind of a concluding comment talking about gender roles, which we may not really get to that until the lunch discussion. I want to summarize. Here's what the Bible says about gender. Like, if you want a New Testament summary of gender roles, here it is. Okay? So basically, prefatory comment, 5 things that Paul affirms, 5 affirmations, and then kind of, here's what the New Testament teaches on gender roles, so that you actually can go, oh, this is what the text seems to at least be arguing for. All right? And then you can make decisions, what you think about it from there. Okay, so here's the first thing. Prefatory comment. It's just an observation. As you read the New Testament, one of the things that both Paul and Jesus and all of the other New Testament authors seem to want to see changed lives. In other words, think about this. When Jesus says, follow me, he wants people to like reorient their life and start living a new way. When Paul says, I was dead and now I'm alive, he's actually saying something has happened. I've moved into a whole new way of living. Okay? When James says, faith without deeds is dead. In other words, if you have faith and it doesn't produce fruit in your life, it's not real faith. You see how all of those things are saying, like, fundamentally, this message is meant to change lives. So, how many 21st century Americans come to church looking for a changed life? Think about that for a second. How many people are going to church saying, I want my life blown up and changed and moving in a whole new direction? If we're looking for change, you go to the gym for a changed life, okay? Or you go to AA for a changed life, or you go to a therapist for a changed life, or you go to grad school, or you look for a romantic partner. But most people in America are not coming to the church to be like, please change my life. Most people in America, this is a sweeping generalization, but I think it's accurate. Most Americans in churches are actually looking for God to kind of stamp approval on their existing lives and say, you all are okay. It's those people out there that aren't. And what I want to point out is, if you're not coming to a church looking for a changed life, if you're not approaching God, if you're not approaching Jesus, not approaching the Bible, not approaching church, looking for things that are going to change your life, much of the New Testament, if it's built with this idea of like, we're here to change your life, really shake things up, it's just going to feel weird and puzzling and probably off-putting to you. For instance, if you went to an AA meeting because you're like, I really am just looking for some friends to hang out with, you're going to be, okay, you're like, why are all these people going around the room doing this? You see what I'm saying? You're in the room, but they're there for a different purpose. And I think oftentimes, like, Christianity is kind of meant to be a lot like what an AA meeting is. My life's a mess, and I got to figure out how to like move in a new direction. But most people in churches aren't looking for that. And I think the early Christians, the people that became Christians, they were not just looking for changed lives, they were looking for a changed world. And as a result, if that's what you're looking for, you're going to approach the text differently. Instead of going, hey, I really basically want the text to affirm what I already do or believe, I'm actually coming to the text going, I don't know what the heck's going on. I got problems. My life is a mess. You just have a different posture. And I want to point that out. Okay? So that's just kind of the preface. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. Second thing. 5 things.
Wait, so how does that affirm women?
That has nothing to do with it's
Okay.
Here's what I'm getting at. That doesn't affirm women.
Okay.
Per se. But it changes how we approach the text.
Okay.
In other words, most of us, when it comes to women, to whatever we think the way things ought to be with women, when we come to the text, we actually want the text to reinforce whatever my pre-existing position, and that's true of people that are very conservative or people that are very liberal.
Right, we're looking for something to back up.
We're trying to use the text to back up our existing way of the life, as opposed to coming to the text and going, what about my life needs to be radically restructured? And it's just a different posture that's going to cause you to read differently, and you might not find it as offensive if you read that way, because you're looking at it differently, and you're willing to consider different things. It's a great question. Okay, yeah.
Are you kind of saying with this, like,
Men should be silent. Oh, wait, no, I'm just kidding. Go ahead. Couldn't resist.
that, like, what we should be doing, what the 21st century Christian church should be doing, is similar to what the first century church was doing, which was going to church to have their lives changed?
Yes, absolutely. Every single one of us should think, am I actually seeking God to change my life? And you'd be amazed at how few people are actually in church thinking that. We kind of think that the change is like, I said a prayer, I believed in Jesus, now when I die I get to go to heaven. That's all the change he had in mind. And what I'm going to try to show you from this, what Paul is talking about with women is actually about, we're going to transform the world. And it's actually going to carry over into eternity. And when you look at it through that lens, it makes a whole lot more sense. Some of the things that he said, now there's still some things that are really hard to understand. Okay? Not trying to oversimplify or make this easier, like brush anything under the rug. But, okay, so let's talk about 5 affirmations. The first one is beauty. All right? What's the basis for beauty? I want you to think about what the Roman world thought the basis for beauty was. If you look down at verse 9, and I know it talks about some stuff in men here. I'm really trying to focus in on the women, because the women is the stuff that puts us, it's most off-putting to us. And so I'm just trying to hone in and actually get to these things. Paul basically says, I want women, this is in verse 9, to adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly attire. Okay. Paul is going to say, a woman's beauty is not in your braided hair or your gold or your pearls or your costly attire. Those are external. Now, he's not saying that you can't put on clothes, or he only wants you to wear cheap clothes. You see what I'm saying? He's saying that's not the source of your beauty.
Is he saying beauty's is he saying beauty's not just skin deep?
Yes. Yeah. Now, he's going to say more than that. We'll get there in just a second. I want you to think about how radical this is. Okay, before I jump ahead. Okay. He says, beauty is not in braided hair, gold, pearls, the things that you put on, external. And then he says this, rather, what is proper for women who profess godliness, and he's going to list 3 things, which we'll get to. Modesty, respectable, and what's the third one? Respectable, really it's modesty, self-control, and good works. We'll talk about those in a second. But the point is, he's saying your beauty isn't external. And he's going to counter and say your beauty is actually internal. All right? 1 Peter 3 says something similar, and we looked at that in the previous 2 weeks, at least referenced it. Peter says something super, super, super similar. He says, don't let your adorning be external, and then he mentions braided hair, gold jewelry, clothing that you wear. You hear how similar that sounds. And he says, rather, let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, internal. In other words, it's the person there is something in your heart, the you in your heart. That's actually where your beauty lies. Now think about this for just a second. Based on the last 2 weeks, was Roman culture highly sexualized?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. Hyper sexualized. Very sexualized. What about our culture?
Yes.
Is our culture sexualized? Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. In a highly sexualized culture, your value as women is oftentimes tied to your beauty, your attractiveness, your desirability. And your desirability is primarily going to be tied to your looks, your appearance, and your body. So for most women, in a highly sexualized culture, it is very important to accentuate your assets, downplay your deficits, and the way that we do that primarily, if you can't afford surgery, is by what you wear or don't. It's how you cover, it's how you reveal, it's how you amplify, it's what you hint at. Okay? Now listen, women, first of all, do you feel that in our culture, that you're being judged by your appearance? You're like, maybe, I'm not sure. No, every woman I know is like, oh my gosh, I'm constantly being evaluated on my appearance.
Even by other women.
Even by other women. Okay, now listen. How would that be? Well, it's great if you're in the top 1%. All right? Now think about this for just a second. In Roman culture, if you're a beautiful woman, who are you competing with? Girls in your town, girls in your village, maybe girls in your, like countryside. It's very local. In modern American culture, who are you competing with? Everybody in the fucking world. And guess what? None of us are in the top 1%. You know what I'm saying? Okay, even women, and this is actually, like you guys can go read this, when they sit down and talk to women that are stunningly beautiful, how many of them, if they're being honest, start talking about their insecure? Even though they're in the top 1%, they're still deeply insecure. Because they're living in this culture that is constantly evaluating, and they know that sooner or later somebody else is going to come along that's going to be more beautiful than they are. It is just like you have this window of opportunity, and it goes so quickly. And you were being judged against everybody, and now you're judged against AI as well. And do you see what I'm saying? It's like incredibly pressuring. And Christianity, now here's the thing, doesn't just say that your beauty is internal. True beauty is the hidden person of the heart. That's big. Christianity goes even further and says true beauty is being precious in God's sight. You see that? It doesn't just move the source of beauty to what's inside you. It actually moves it to something that's outside of you that says really what matters, everything. If you're beautiful in God's sight, that's actually significant and sufficient enough. And if that doesn't move you, it's probably because God is not very real to most of us. But if God is real to you and you value and appreciate Him, if that is there, then the idea that your beauty actually comes from how He feels about you, not from how anybody else feels about you, that would be incredibly liberating if you could really believe that. Okay? So for the early women, okay, it moved them because, now get this, it actually gave them massive agency over their beauty. They could cultivate things that were precious in God's sight. That's what 1 Peter is saying. That's what Paul is saying here as well. You can actually do things where God goes, oh my gosh, that is beautiful. All right, and we'll talk about what they are in just a second. What that means is they no longer relied on men or the culture to find them beautiful because they were part of a counterculture that constantly reminded them that Jesus found them beautiful, and they could grow into that even more. Now listen, if that's Paul's view of women, does that sound like Paul has a problem with women? Or does he actually have a really, he sees more deeply than the culture? That seems like a good thing, okay? Now, it doesn't make everything easier, but do you see how that view of women in that culture, many women would have said wow, that's significant, okay? So, how do you grow and amplify your internal beauty? That's the next four things. So, beauty is the first thing that Paul does this massive affirmation. Second thing is virtue. All right, and really it's these three words here: respectability, modesty, self-control. The Romans already had the concept of modesty as a virtue. We talked about that the previous 2 weeks. Okay? So what Paul is saying here is not like, oh, the Romans value this thing and we're going to chuck what that Romans... They actually says, no, the Romans are on the right track. Modesty is a virtue. So it's not like... In our culture, we sometimes think Christians are puritanical, the early church, puritanical. Roman culture was, licentious and liberated. It actually wasn't the case. It was for men. In other words, remember we talked about that? Men get a free pass on almost everything. But for women, Roman culture really wanted to see modesty, wanted to see fidelity, wanted to see self-control, all of those things. We talked about that last week. The point is, Paul takes that and he actually he says something that the Romans would have said. Modesty, self-control, respectability. But he says it for a radically different reason and to a radically different group. Okay? What Paul is saying here is not chuck Roman culture. He's saying, no, they're actually right on this. Modesty is virtuous. But Christianity wants you to view that value differently. In the Roman culture, modesty is for whom? Noble women. In other words, if you're a prostitute, or you're a slave woman, or you've done something shameful, you don't even have modesty. You're a non-being anymore. Do you see the class distinction? Modesty is for the upper class of women. Okay? If you don't have virtue, if you don't have modesty, you don't have any virtue or any value. They looked at women who lost their modesty as pieces of furniture or as animals, almost like different species. There is no value there. And that's why they had no problem with their sexual consumption of that class. Okay? In Roman culture, modesty or virtue, so number one, it's only for a class. Number two, it's easily lost. We talked about this last week. Roman culture was extremely permissive for guys because they valued masculinity. It was extremely restrictive for women. They were scarce goods. So the revolutionary part of Christianity is not modesty per se. It's modesty for every woman. Think about this. You're a slave woman. You're a prostitute. You've been violated. You lost your modesty. Like, in other words, if a Roman guy violated a noble woman, guess who's the one that suffered in the view of society? The woman. Okay? And it's like shame. And the Christians looked at it and said, you can take people that have had terrible things happen to them or they belong to a lower class and they can actually still put on modesty, self-control, and respectability. You can actually have virtue. Your virtue is not tied to your class or your performance. It's tied to something different. In our culture, what destroys a woman's virtue is failure or even accusation of failure. But in Christianity, there is a whole system for dealing with failure. So somebody says of a woman, she's a prostitute or she's screwed up or whatever. Okay? Christianity's like, God doesn't not love her because she's not anybody who repents can find forgiveness of sins. Anybody who repents and starts following Jesus is cleansed, is washed. And the early Christian culture practiced it. So let's say you walk in to a church and you're like, my life is a mess. I'm a slave. And they're like, come on in. And they treated you as if you were part of the family. And there are well-off people there. There are poor people. Like, do you see the massive equality of that? Women were like, there is no other place where we get to sit at the table in this, like, other worship did not have men and women worshiping together. Okay? They did not have a view of virtue that came from, are you following Jesus? That's virtue. That's where your virtue is defined. Does that make sense? Massive change of paradigm. So you could have people that the culture says are shameful and have no value, and in Christianity they'd be like, you have absolute value, no matter what you've done. Anybody who repents can be forgiven, restored, and is actually a beautiful person if they follow Jesus. See what I'm saying? So beauty, virtue, those two things. Now again, does that view of women and of virtue, does that sound like Paul has a problem with women? Or does Paul actually just have a different way of measuring things where he's like, what really gives you virtue, it's not your business success, it's not your beauty success, it's can you be honest about your brokenness and your need for a Savior, and can you start to realign in that direction? That makes sense? So you got beauty, you got virtue, all classes, rich or poor, okay? Welcome and respected. Any questions on that? Third thing. Did you want to say something? Okay. Third thing. Work. Do you see down here where he says, let them adorn themselves with respectable apparel, modesty and self-control, and then down in verse 10, with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. Okay, I want to talk about vocation. When you hear good works, and I debated, I think this is important enough to say, so I'm going to, I need about 10 minutes to say this. I think it's worth it. And I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of 1 Corinthians, 2 chapters. Okay, we've said this already in the preceding weeks, 4 or 5 weeks ago. When you see the word good works, that is not talking about do good deeds like a Boy Scouts. Remember that? In other words, he's not saying, ladies, go do your good deeds. Very patriotic, go be a good Boy Scout, Girl Scout. That is not what he's saying. In the New Testament, this phrase, good deeds, has everything to do with the kingdom, with shalom, healing, flourishing of the city, okay? It's much more like Roman benefactors. Their good works, public works. They would, I built an aqueduct system for this city, for my city. Now, they didn't do it for the poor. They did it for the rich because it was a way of getting like glory. Okay? But the point here is Paul is calling women into this public works like benefactors along with the men. He's making them full partners. And if you search the New Testament, so here's, if you want to dig into this further, here's how you do it. Use your Bible app to go search for the word work in the New Testament, and you're going to pick up all the places that mention good works. You might want to search for deed, depending on your translation. The ESV is a good translation. But if you search for work, you're going to find all the references that talk about the work. Devote yourself to this kind of, and you can actually start to get a picture for what the work looks like. Or you can take notes and listen to this part again, and I'll summarize it for you real quickly. There are 2 frames in the New Testament where work plays out. One is the frame of building Christian community. That's the work of the saints in the church. The second, in other words, what I'm saying is when Paul talks about building church and how you do stuff in the church, he calls it a work. All right? The second is this frame of shalom, healing for the nations, trying to care for the brokenness of the world. And ironically, that doesn't just happen through social work, although that's part of it. It also happens through vocational works, like when Paul tells slaves, work for your master as unto the Lord. He's actually getting at all of your work callings actually are a place for the work of God. Okay? Now listen, what's really interesting about Christianity's view on work, I'm going to give you 2 passages that you can read through on your own and see this. 1 Corinthians 3, 1 Corinthians 15. I'm just going to whirlwind it for you. Ready? Okay. 1 Corinthians 3:9, Paul says, for me, or for we, and he's referring there to Paul and Apollos. You can flip over if you want to look at it. If you flip back to the left, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. It starts in verse 9. This verse is worth reading. We are God's fellow workers. So he's saying, he's referring right now to leaders. He's saying, we leaders, specifically him and Apollos, are God's fellow workers. You hear the working language? So what that means is, Paul and Apollos, the leaders are working, but who else is working? God is working. Okay? And then immediately after this, he's going to describe their work and God's work. He says, you are God's field, you are God's building. See that? Now here's what's going on. He's actually using two parallel metaphors. One is an agricultural metaphor of a field. The other is a construction metaphor of a building. And what's going to happen right after this is he's going to unpack the building metaphor in verses like 10 through 17. So listen to what he says here. You're God's field, you're God's building. That means God's doing some working. We leaders are also doing some working. And then verses 10 through 17, he unpacks it. He says, what God is building is a what? It's a temple. Okay? And that temple is not a physical temple. It's actually a body. It's the people of the church. So when the New Testament says your body is a temple, that's always in the plural. The body of y'all is a temple. So he's saying here, God is building something with you people. Leaders lay the foundation. He says that in verse 10. But then other people build on it. You get this? God's working, leaders work, but then everybody else in the church also builds on this temple thing. And he uses a really interesting example. He said, if anyone builds on the foundation, this is verse 12, with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw. He's going, there's different kinds of material. Okay? And then right after that, he says, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it. What day is he talking about? Judgment Day. So the image is you're all building, and what you're building is actually going to be like tested by fire. And some of it has the potential to survive. But what do you think about the wood, hay, and straw?
No.
It's like blaze of glory. Have you ever lit straw on fire? Here's what's great. Sometime take like a gallon of diesel and pour it all over a pile of straw, and you light it, and it just goes up, okay? And when you're done, what's left after straw burns? Nothing. I mean, it's not even ash, it's like chaff. I mean, it almost disintegrates. Here's the point. These are ordinary Christians, okay? They're working to variety of materials. Judgment is going to reveal were those materials something that lasted or something that didn't last. Here's the key. Each person's work is going to be revealed. What endures? And the point is, God's working, the leaders are working, you're working, and you get this, guys. This is so significant. Your work right now has the power to survive into eternity if it's done the right way with the right materials. That's what he's saying. He's saying the way you work right now, and that could be in the church, but it could also be in your work, if done in a certain way, it's going to burn up and none of it will remain. But there is a way that you can actually be doing your work in both of those frames that actually survives into eternity. You're building something that lasts. All right, follow that? Does that make sense? Whirlwind. Now flip forward to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Here, he's talking about resurrection. Really famous passage. And he's talking, most of the first 30 verses are about Jesus' resurrection. But down in verse 34, look at what he says. First of all, wake up. Don't go on sinning. You're like, wow, that was interesting. In other words, there's something about resurrection where all of a sudden he's like, y'all need to wake up. Don't keep sinning. Okay? And then you think, now remember what we said, sin is not just being bad, it's being self-focused. And you're like, okay, why would sin be such a big deal? And what he's going to say next in verse 36 is he starts talking about sowing seeds. And you should go, wait a second, that's the field metaphor. Remember before? He had a field metaphor, an agricultural metaphor, and he had a building metaphor. And he unpacked the building metaphor, but he hasn't unpacked the field. Now he's unpacking the field metaphor. Okay? In verse 37 and 48, really 37 through 48, it's all of this language about sowing. What kind of sowing are we talking about, Lucy? Sowing like fabric? No. Sowing seeds. Planting things. Yep. Okay. And what he says down in verse 42, what is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. So here's the key thought. Lucy, how big are seeds? They're really small. When they grow, they become big. And they don't just look like seeds, now they look like plants.
Or vegetables.
Okay, or vegetables or trees. Or what else comes from seeds? Weeds, thorns, thistles, thickets, those kinds of things. Here's what he's saying. The point is, he's saying, number one, you're sowing things right now. And they're actually going to look like they perish. But they actually, when you sow something, you are planting it. And what is planted cannot help but grow. It will sprout. It will bear fruit. And after the death thing happens, in other words, the ground, you put the seed in the ground, he's like, something else comes to life. And that something else is either going to be, remember how before there were different kinds of materials you could build with? I think he's actually making the case here that there are different things. This is why he's saying, stop sinning. Your sinning is sowing to the flesh. He's saying you actually need to be sowing to the Spirit. And if you sow to the Spirit, the things that you are doing right now actually have eternal consequence and bear an eternal fruit, and something lasts. He's saying the same thing. It's the same metaphor. Some of the building survives. The things you're planting right now survive. If you look down in verse 38, therefore my beloved, or 58, therefore my beloved brothers, and you can translate that brothers, it's brethren, it can be sisters too. Be steadfast, immovable, abounding in the work of, do you hear this? Abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord our labor is not in vain. Do you see the connection? He's talking about work in both places. He's saying God works, he's saying leaders work, he's saying people work, and he's saying what you are doing right now in this life is sowing seeds that are going to bear fruit eternally. Okay? So if you're sowing seeds to your flesh, you're sowing seeds to your appetite, you're sowing seeds to your addictions, you're doing all of those things, guess what? There's a consequence of that. So stop, don't keep doing that. Sow to a different thing. And it's actually going to build something that lasts eternally. The New Testament has this incredible theology of work, ordinary vocational work, your work, but also building Christian community work, that's ministry. Those things, both of those frames, what you're working on right now in this world, it's eternal, it bears consequences, okay? And both men and women are called into it. And that's what so when you hear this, let women focus on good works. What he's really saying is, in the Roman culture, who focused on the work of the Roman culture? What was the work of the Roman culture? Conquer, rule. Who does it? Men. In the Christian culture, what's the work of the culture? We are going to garden. We are going to cure. We are going to heal. We are going to cultivate. Who does it? Both men and women. Do you see this like this? Paul is going, women, you all have every bit of much place at the table in the work of the Christian church. And women heard it, and and they responded. Listen, there's a quote by Eusebius, theologian writing around 250 AD. He mentions a letter from Cornelius, the bishop at Rome at the time, 250 AD. Church is still not legal, still underground. Okay, it still has persecution. And Cornelius, the Bishop of Rome, says, by the way, our church right now is currently supporting, you ready for this? 1,500 widows and poor people. Who do you think was doing all that work? Women. Okay? Because the church was still mostly made up of women. We know that the women were deaconesses. All right? We know that there were women deaconesses. We know that most of the early church, the women in that culture were the ones that had the most time, space, bandwidth, availability, and they had been green-lighted to do this cultural work. So they're caring for the poor. All right? Now they're doing other things besides that as well. But the point, do you see how like affirming that is? Does it sound like Paul has a problem with women? He's like, no way. I want women every bit as much into the work as the rest of us. Okay. So, fourth thing. Told you this is a whirlwind. Let women learn. This is back to 1 Timothy. Is this too much? This is important. And to think that I was going to put this all in my third point last week. It's like, no way. Okay. If you go back to 1 Timothy, let women learn quietly with all submissiveness. Most of us in our culture are so focused on our own like knee-jerk reaction. We hear the quietly with all submissiveness and we don't even hear the rest. We think, good grief, he's telling women to be quiet and submissive. I said previously, anytime you see submit, it is in the New Testament. It is always asterisked. It is never absolute submission. So wives, submit to your husbands. It's like, yeah, except when they tell you to do something that that like doesn't agree with Jesus. Slaves, submit to your masters. Yeah, until they tell you to like do something that's not in line with, you see what I'm saying? Submission's always assuming that it fits with Jesus' values. Do we call Caesar Lord? Never. Do we submit to the rulers? Sure. Unless they tell us to call Caesar Lord. Then we don't. Do we submit to our husbands? Sure. Unless they call us to do something that's not in line with Christian values. Do we submit to our masters? You bet. Okay, so here's my point. That submission, we hear that, we're like, oh my gosh, quietly with submissiveness. What he's actually saying is, women, you all are green-lighted to be massive learners. And the early church I'm just going to say this. The early church responded. So in Roman culture, who gets educated? Not just men, noble men. Okay, even if you're a noble woman, do you get it? No, they don't educate their noble women. What are the noble women for?
Home ec.
Home ec. Having babies. That's literally it. Okay, the Christian church, let me just read my notes. What the women would have heard when they said, let women learn. I think the early Christians, the quietly with submissiveness part, they would have been like, yeah, sure, fine, that's great. We get to learn. The early church taught slaves to read, taught children to read, taught boys and girls to read, taught women to read. Like, they were like, we are freaking teaching people. Massive increase in literacy. Massive increase in knowledge of the Bible. Massive increase in theology. We actually know of early theologians who were men who were writing, and they've actually got women that are like in conversation. We don't have much written by women, but we know that women were actually trained in Greek and Hebrew in certain cases. And you go, dude, this is the early church. So whatever you say about, like, it's so easy to miss how much they looked at everybody and said, y'all need to learn. And I think for us, the question is, you guys all have the ability to learn. Are you learners? We have a lot of people in our culture, even though they have the entire freedom to learn whatever they want, they don't learn anything unless it advances their career. And it's like, early Christianity is like, don't just learn for the sake of advancing your career. We're going to learn to like create a new subculture That's going to be radically different from the world around us. And it was. And everybody got in because they were like, oh my gosh, these people are educating everybody. These people are educating across class. They're allowing women, PhD, get it. You want to learn Greek and Hebrew? Go for it.
How does this relate to the fact that women can't teach?
I'll talk about that when I get to the things.
Okay.
And like, so we will get to that over lunch when I summarize the gender roles. Okay, last thing, real quick. Okay, so here's what we got. Beauty, virtue, work, learning. Do you hear how positive all those things are? Do you hear how women in that day and age would have been like, this is amazing? Okay. Here's the fifth thing. It has to do with family, and I'm just going to say this. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. Okay, and then he goes into this. Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. There's a lot of questions about what that even means. I'm going to run with the most obvious interpretation that it has something to do with family and kids. The childbearing part. Remember how Roman culture was brutal on women. They were primarily seen as objects for men's sexual release, particularly slaves. Okay? Or they were producers of heirs, if you're a freeborn or noble. Many, many women died in childbirth. That was in the reading from the past couple of weeks. Abortion was widely practiced. Guess what? Many, many, many women died from botched abortion. It was terrible. Okay? Women were regularly forced to abandon or kill their girl babies. Also in the reading from a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if you saw it, there was a guy named Hilarion. It was not hilarious, but that literally is his name, Hilarion. And he's writing to his wife, I think he's down in Egypt, and she's pregnant, and he says this, he's like, sending greetings, and he's like, by the way, I hope your pregnancy is going really well. If it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, discard it. And then he immediately goes on, can't wait to see you. Do you see how how casual that was? So imagine that you're a woman in that culture. Remember how we said last week? We can prove historically now that out of 600 families, only 6 raised more than one girl. Remember that? They were discarding. So let's say you're a woman and you actually want to have kids. And you have a baby and your husband says in Roman culture, get rid of it. Christian culture says we don't get rid of any of our kids. We are not going to practice abortion. We're going to be sexually pure. Okay? Only have sex within marriage. That was actually the Roman nobilities. But the same sexual rules are going to apply to guys as they do to women. Okay? Guys are going to have to toe the line. Guys live by the same standard now. If women want to have kids and want to have families, we are absolutely going to support that, even if they're girls. In fact, we'll go out, okay, and we will rescue baby girls that have been discarded, and we'll raise them in the church. And we will actively help slaves gain their freedom, and we will teach them and raise them in the church. And so basically it's this. Early Christians saw children as a gift, family as a garden, mothers as a secret weapon. They were the primary raisers, the primary educators. They were the primary culture shapers of the Christian church, both in and outside the church. Massively affirming vision for family, and particularly for children, and saying, listen, we don't get kids without women. We need to give those women every opportunity to have kids, to raise those kids, okay? And if that means we men work our asses off to support them to do that, that's what we're going to do as a church. And those women, in turn, help the church pursue all of this social work in the world. Okay. Do you see those are the Those are the 5 affirmations. And what we should all be saying is like, wow, does that actually sound like Paul has a problem with women? I don't think the women in Paul's culture had a problem with Paul.
Where does the want part come in?
What'd you say?
The want, like when you want to have kids.
Yeah, so let's come back to that over lunch. And what I'm going to do, because it's part of this, let me give you the summary. I'm just going to say this really quickly. And then let me find it in my notes. Hang on. Okay. Here's the summary of gender roles. And what we'll do is, like, just don't forget that question, but we'll just talk through it over lunch. Okay, you ready for Christian gender roles from the New Testament? Number 1, in sex, only male, female. Is that a restriction? Yeah, it was. Okay? But that's the only restriction. Like, and you can look at Romans 2 primarily for that. In other words, Christianity tweaked Roman culture, more than just tweaked. Christianity said we have a different sexual culture. Gender is actually really, really important in this. It's got to be male, female. Anything that's not male or female is out of bounds. Okay? Second thing, in marriage, wives submit and husbands sacrifice. Okay. We've already talked a little bit about that. Submission is asterisked. Okay? And what you also see Paul saying is, like, wives, your body doesn't belong to you, it belongs to your husband. And then he immediately turns around and says, by the way, husbands, your body doesn't belong to you, it belongs to your wife. Do you hear the mutuality in that? So even as he's saying submit, there's this very, very mutual within the relationship. Okay? And women, you have a church that's, if your husband is kind of being oppressive, you've got a church that will defend and support you. So, sex, male, female. Marriage, wives submit. Family, women are the only ones who can carry and bear children. I know we're working in our culture where that doesn't have to be the case, but through most of human history, that has been the case. Okay? And as a result, Tiff, this will kind of get at it. Women, because they are the only ones who can carry and bear, doesn't mean they can't work, but they should be given the opportunity to carry, bear, rear, and raise all of their children. And that means men are going to have to work. Okay? What you never find is like women do the work, men relax and enjoy themselves. Nope, not there. So in sex, male, female. In marriage, wives submit, but husbands sacrifice, the way Christ loved the church. In family, women carry and bear and should have the opportunity to raise their children, all of them, not just the preferred gender. Fourth, in the church, I think this phrase, do not permit women to have authority or teach. We talk about this in our membership class. I think it's referring to a very specific kind of authoritative teaching that was the bishop's seat. It was the teaching pastor. And you're going to find right after this in chapter 3, he goes, here's what the qualifications for elder or bishop are. So I think all he's saying there, now there's debate, but I think we also know there are places where women exercise authority. I can show you those verses.
Yeah.
Okay, and there are also places, you mentioned this, was it you who mentioned this last week? Titus actually says, hey, by the way, we're looking for elder women that can teach.
Yeah, because I remember looking it up and I was like, there's many places
So,
where women are meetings.
Exactly. So whatever it means, it doesn't mean no teaching and no authority. And I would say, and this is historically how it was practiced, the early Christians of this time, literally you see women in every role except for the bishop/elder role. So there's your summary. But guess what? They can be elders' wives. Yes. Okay, and that means they're involved. And can they be involved in mercy and shalom in the work? Yes, 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 yes. So those are your 4 things. Gender roles in the New Testament. In sex, it's male, female. In marriage, wives submit, but husbands sacrifice. In family, men need to work and support their families. Women should have the opportunity to rear raise all of their kids if they'd like to. In church, the only thing that is off limit is like the bishop's seat and maybe the elder role. And they can still be really involved in everything else. Now, are those some boundaries? Yeah. We just need to be honest. We live in a culture that says there should be no boundaries. In the Christian culture, I said God actually made some boundaries, and we flourish best when we stick to those boundaries. And so what I want to point out is how few the boundaries actually are. Okay? I think they're pretty limited. All right. Let me pray for us. We'll go to the Lord's Supper.